Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Welcome back. Our job in this presentation is to talk about sexual response. And we'll see, like with most parts of the reproductive system, we're going to see that all bodies have the same parts, but they can just be oriented a little bit differently. So when we talk about the sexual response, when we get into the specifics, we are going to go through the mechanism that's described in our text, and it is centered around the male body response. And we'll see there's really not a lot of research out there on the female body, but I think it's probably fair in most cases to assume about the same mechanism. So when we get into that area where not totally sure if that is going to also be true for female bodies, I'll let you know. So to start out, I'm going to add a step that's not listed for us in our OpenStax textbook. And so we're going to start first, which I don't want to use that red color, so let me change my marker. Well, we're going to say the first step is in desire. And here's where things get pretty interesting, because we've been tagging about the reproductive system. We've seen there's overlap with the endocrine system, but we haven't brought in a whole lot of information about overlap with the nervous system. But what we'll actually see is in the brain, you have what we can describe as a dual control system. And so you have several different parts of the brain that are going to be involved in this dual control system, several of which we've not ever really talked about in the course. So it gets pretty detailed as far as that goes. But you have a group of cells that are involved in what is called the sexual excitation system. And you can use just SE for short here. And we can think about this as the accelerator system. So this is like the yes, let's have some sex. And then you have what we can call the sexual inhibition system, or SI for short. And this would be, we can think of these as the brakes. So this is like the no, I don't want to have some sex. And the thing that's interesting is about both systems, they're constantly looking around for sex-related activity. So the sexual excitation system is constantly sort of on the lookout for moving forward for sex-related activity. And then the sexual inhibition system is sort of like on the lookout for reasons to not have sex. And so what we see is that these two systems should be in balance in a way to signal desire. So in order to have desire, you would both need to have your sexual excitation system saying go, and you would have to have your foot off the brake, as it were. So in some cases, you might have a feeling of wanting to have sex, but also not wanting to have sex. So sometimes we'll see you might be wanting sex, but your brakes might be turned on. And a lot of what's happening in terms of the sexual excitation, the accelerator, and the brakes can be context related. So for instance, those brakes might be on when you're at work or school and it's not appropriate for you to engage in sexual activity, or it might be that you're super stressed because you have a lot of schoolwork to catch up on, and so that's pressing down your brakes. In some cases, some people turn on their accelerator when they're feeling stressed as a way of dealing with that response. Maybe if you're sick, your brakes are on, and so forth. So you might still find an individual sexually desirous, but if your brakes are pressed down, you're not going to get to that desire. Another thing that I think is important to mention here is what's called arousal non-concordance. And as far as what I can gather from this is when you your genitals are seeming to be aroused. So this is taken as kind of into the next step, right? So let me just go ahead and say like step 2 is arousal. Let's go ahead and define arousal as being triggered by thoughts and stimulation. When we talk about arousal non-concordance, what can happen here is your genitals can already go with it. So your genitals can be moving into this arousal stage, even when your brain maybe is not in the desirous stage. So for instance, your blood can flow to your genitals based on learning that this is sex-related stimuli. Even if you don't want or like what's happening. So blood is still, basically you have a part of the brain that's saying, oh, this is sex related, let me get my genitals ready, even if the desire is not there. So the only way to really know if someone is moving on into the next stages of arousal and so forth is to ask. So a lot of times we think about with male bodies, we know that you're aroused based on having an erection. And so the thought might be, oh, you want to proceed. But the only way to really know is to ask. With female bodies, a lot of times we say, if the vulva is wet, then that individual is ready to proceed. But that doesn't necessarily indicate desire. And the reverse of that, right? So maybe a person, um, you know, is ready to go, but the genitals are not responding in those kind of sex related ways. Okay, moving into the third step. Now we're getting into male body specific information, talking about erection. But the thing to remember is that the female body, all bodies have erectile tissue. We call it the clitoris in the female, and we call it the penis in the male. And so my understanding is, and a little bit of research I read around this, is these kind of steps are occurring in all body types. So here what we're going to see is the release of a gas, nitric oxide, which is acting as a hormone. So we'll abbreviate nitric oxide as NO. We've talked about it before as a vasodilator. So this is going to be released from parasympathetic neurons near the blood vessels and the penis. And what we're going to see is vasodilation. In those blood vessels. And we'll see that this is going to trigger also the release of NO from endothelial cells of the, that would be of your arteries, increasing this vasodilation. So this is a positive feedback mechanism. So parasympathetic division releases that initial nitric oxide, causing vasodilation. As you get vasodilation happening, you perpetuate that by releasing more nitric oxide from those cells of the arteries, continuing the vasodilation. The increased blood is going to flow into the erectile tissues. Remember, we talked about these as the corpus cavernosum and corpus spongiosum. And we see that these are erectile tissues in the penis, but we'll see that these are erectile tissues in the clitoris as well. And as the erectile tissue fills with blood, essentially you close off penile veins, venules, preventing the blood to leave. So you're basically engorging or directing and quite a lot of blood flow into the penis and then preventing that blood from exiting. So this is providing the erection or hardness and the male genital. And I suspect, and based on my reading, it appears that this is true in the female genital as well, looking at the clitoris. When we talk about the next stage, we are now being specific about male body. So the next step that we have is emission, which I mentioned already. Emission is movement of sperm into the pelvic cavity. So that's talking about smooth muscle contraction in the epididymis and the vas deferens to propel the sperm into that ejaculatory duct area. And then when we get into the final step, that is the step called ejaculation. And again, this is very specific to male bodies. And this is the movement out of the body through the urethra. And remember, we see that those sperm are able to move. They are able to swim on their own once they're in contact with the seminal vesicle secretion and all of that fructose. But we are seeing contraction of muscle to help propel that sperm actually out of the male body. All right, y'all, we are ready to move more fully into the female reproductive system anatomy and discussion. So stay tuned. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.